At Christmas dinner, my dad said, "You're a burden. Get out of my house." For 10 years, I sent home every military paycheck. Now wounded, I was treated like trash. I took a bus heading to my grandfather's farm. And the moment he saw me, he revealed a truth that left me completely shattered. The desert does not forgive, and it certainly never forgets. For Sergeant David Coleman, the heat of the Middle East wasn't just a weather condition, it was a physical weight, a shimmering veil of dust and adrenaline that had defined his existence for 8 long years. But as he sat in the back of a military transport vehicle, clutching a discharge folder that felt heavier than his rifle ever did, the heat he felt wasn't from the sun. It was the phantom fire burning in a limb that was no longer there. David looked down at the empty space where his right leg used to be. The prosthetic felt like a foreign object, a cold, mechanical intrusion on his body. He closed his eyes, and immediately, the smell of cordite and the deafening crack of the iod filled his senses. He remembered the screams of his squad, the taste of copper in his mouth, and the darkness that had swallowed him whole. "You're a hero, son," the doctors had told him. "The country owes you a debt." David didn't want the country to owe him. He just wanted to go home. He had spent nearly a decade pouring every cent of his combat pay into a bank account held jointly with his parents, James and Linda. Every bonus, every hazardous duty paycheck, every cent earned in the mud and blood had been wired back to the suburbs of Ohio. He had been the invisible pillar holding up the Coleman household, ensuring his younger brother, Mark, had the tuition for a prestigious university and that his parents never had to worry about a mortgage again. He imagined the homecoming. He pictured his mother's tears of joy, his father's firm handshake of pride, and a warm meal that didn't come out of a plastic pouch. He envisioned a sanctuary where the nightmares couldn't find him. But when the taxi pulled up to the sprawling 2-story colonial house, a house much larger and more opulent than the one he had left years ago, the air felt different. The lawn was manicured to perfection. A brand new luxury SUV sat in the driveway. The "Welcome Home" banner he had secretly hoped for was nowhere to be seen. David hopped out of the cab, his crutches digging into the soft turf. He took a deep breath, adjusted his duffel bag, and knocked. The door swung open. His mother, Linda, stood there, dressed in a silk robe, holding a glass of expensive wine. She looked at David, then looked down at his crutches, and finally at the empty pant leg pinned neatly back. Her expression wasn't one of relief. It was one of profound inconvenience. "David," she said, her voice flat, "we didn't expect you until next week." "The discharge went faster than planned, Mom," David said, trying to force a smile. "It's good to see you." He moved to hug her, but she stepped back slightly, as if afraid his trauma might be contagious. "James," she called out into the house. "David's here. And he's brought his gear. Where are we going to put all this?" James Coleman appeared in the hallway, looking tan and fit, wearing a golf polo that probably cost more than David's monthly disability stipend. He didn't rush forward. He stood at a distance, his eyes scanning David's prosthetic with a mixture of pity and distaste. "Welcome back, Dave," James said. "Tough break about the leg. Real tough. I suppose you'll be needing the guest room for a while?" "I figured I'd stay here while I get my physical therapy sorted," David replied, the first seeds of unease planting themselves in his chest. "I sent the last of my savings for the house renovations last month. I thought." Right, James interrupted, glancing at his watch. "Listen, we've got a dinner party with the country club board tonight. It's a big deal. We can't really cancel. There's some leftovers in the fridge. We'll talk in the morning, okay?" As his parents bustled past him, smelling of expensive perfume and entitlement, David stood alone in the foyer of the house his blood had paid for. The silence was deafening. There was no, "Thank you." There was no, "We're glad you're alive." There was only the sound of the SUV pulling out of the driveway, leaving the soldier alone with his ghosts. Over the next few weeks, the tension didn't just grow, it curdled. David spent his days at the VA hospital, enduring grueling physical therapy sessions that left him shaking with exhaustion. He spent his nights staring at the ceiling, the PTSD clawing at the edges of his mind. He needed support. He needed a family. Instead, he found himself a prisoner in a house of strangers. His parents treated him like a failing investment. They complained about the clunking sound of his prosthetic on the hardwood floors. They whispered in the kitchen about how his moodiness, the crushing depression of PTSD, was ruining the atmosphere of their social gatherings. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening, 2 days before Christmas. David had found a stack of bank statements on the kitchen counter. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the numbers. The hundreds of thousands of dollars he had sent home, money meant to be saved for his future, was gone. It hadn't gone to the mortgage or Mark's tuition alone. It had gone to country club memberships, designer handbags, European vacations, and high-stakes day trading. "Where is it?" David asked, his voice low and trembling, as his parents walked into the kitchen. James didn't even look guilty. He poured himself a scotch. "Where's what, David?" "My money. My life savings. The money I earned while people were trying to kill me." Linda sighed, leaning against the marble island. "Honestly, David, don't be so dramatic. We had expenses. Maintaining a certain lifestyle is important for your father's business connections. Besides, we looked after things while you were away. Think of it as a management fee." "A management fee?" David's voice rose, a rare spark of the sergeant coming through. "I lost a leg for that money. I watched friends die for that money. And you spent it on golf." James slammed his glass down. "Watch your tone. You're living under our roof, eating our food. You're a grown man, David, yet you sit around here moping and limping like the world owes you a living. You're a drain on this family's energy. You're depressing your mother. If you're going to be an ungrateful tenant, maybe you should find somewhere else to be a victim." The words hit harder than any shrapnel. David looked at his mother, hoping for a shred of maternal instinct. She simply looked away, adjusting her diamond earring. "Fine," David whispered. "I'll leave." "Good," James snapped. "And take those damn crutches with you. They're scratching the baseboards." David didn't pack much. He didn't have much left. He walked out into the cold December rain, his prosthetic slick on the pavement, with no destination and a heart that had finally, completely, shattered. The Greyhound bus hissed to a halt at a dusty crossroads in rural Oregon. David stepped off, his duffel bag feeling like a lead weight. He was thousands of miles away from the cold, sterile suburban home in Ohio, and even further from the blistering sands of the desert. Before him lay a landscape of rolling emerald hills, thick pine forests, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar and rain. This was the end of the line. This was his grandfather Henry's farm. David hadn't seen his grandfather in nearly a decade. Henry was a man of few words, a Korean War veteran who had long ago retreated to the mountains to raise bees. As David limped up the long, winding dirt driveway, he saw a small, weathered farmhouse nestled among hundreds of colorful wooden boxes, beehives. The screen door creaked open. Henry stood there, his face a map of deep wrinkles, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He didn't look at David's missing leg. He didn't look at the exhaustion etched into David's face. He looked straight into his grandson's eyes. "You're late for chores, Sergeant," Henry said, his voice like gravel. "Put your bags in the shed. Wash up. The bees don't wait for anyone." There was no pity. There was no awkwardness. For the first time in months, David felt his shoulders drop an inch. The first few weeks were a different kind of hell. David's PTSD followed him to the mountains. The sudden crack of a dry branch sounded like a sniper's rifle. The buzzing of the bees reminded him of the low hum of drones. He woke up screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his hands searching for a weapon that wasn't there. One morning, after a particularly bad night, David sat on the porch, his head in his hands. Henry walked over and handed him a heavy canvas suit and a smoker. "They can sense it, you know," Henry said calmly. "Sense what?" David rasped. "The war inside you. If you go into the yard with a heart full of chaos, the bees will react to it. They don't see a soldier. They don't see a cripple. They see energy. If you want them to be calm, you have to find the calm inside yourself first." David looked at the hives. "I don't think I have any calm left, Grandpa." "Then find it. Not for you. For them." Henry led David to the heart of the apiary. He showed David how to pump the smoker, sending cool clouds of white smoke to soothe the colony. He taught him how to move with slow-motion grace, a rhythmic, steady pace that defied the frantic buzzing. At first, David was terrified. Thousands of bees swarmed around his head, a living golden black cloud. But as he focused on the task, carefully lifting the frames, checking the queen, observing the hexagonal perfection of the honeycomb, something strange happened. The noise in his head began to dim. To work with bees, you must be present. You cannot worry about the past or fear the future. You must exist in the millisecond between the sting and the honey. Look at them, David, Henry whispered one afternoon. A colony is a perfect machine. Every bee has a purpose. The old protect the young. The strong feed the weak. They don't cast out the wounded. They work until their wings tatter for the good of the whole. They are the only family that never lies. Weeks turned into months. The physical labor of the farm began to rebuild David's strength. His prosthetic became less of an enemy and more of a tool. He learned the language of the seasons, the blackberry flow of June, the clover honey of July. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. David noticed that Henry's farm was struggling. The equipment was decades old, and Henry was selling his world-class honey for pennies to local wholesalers who didn't appreciate the quality. "Grandpa, we can do more with this," David said one evening, looking at a jar of liquid gold. "I'm an old man, Dave. I just like the quiet." "I've spent years protecting things," David said, his eyes lit with a new fire. "Let me protect this. Let me build this." David began to apply the discipline of a sergeant to the chaos of a farm. He used his remaining disability back pay to buy a laptop and a high-end camera. He started a social media page called The Soldier's Sanctuary. He didn't just sell honey, he told his story. He filmed the bees, the mountains, and his own journey of healing. He spoke about the therapy of the hive. The internet responded. Within months, orders began to pour in from across the country. People weren't just buying honey, they were buying into the idea that a broken man could find sweetness in a bitter world. By the following summer, Coleman and Son Apiaries had grown from a struggling hobby into a thriving business. They hired other local veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. The farm became a literal sanctuary, a place where men who had seen the worst of humanity could work in the peace of nature. David was finally whole. Not because his leg had grown back, but because he had built a life that didn't require his parents' permission to exist. But the world has a way of circling back. And just as David found his peace, the ghosts of Ohio decided they wanted a piece of the gold. It happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after David had been kicked out. A sleek, black European sedan, completely out of place among the mud-splattered pickup trucks, pulled into the farm's driveway. David was in the barn, labeling a batch of premium lavender honey, when he heard the car door slam. He walked out, wiping his hands on his apron. His heart stopped. Standing there, looking like they had stepped off a yacht in the Hamptons, were James and Linda Coleman. Beside them stood Mark, David's younger brother, who looked pale and deeply uncomfortable. "David!" Linda cried out, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary warmth that made David's skin crawl. She rushed forward as if to hug him, but David instinctively stepped back, putting a wooden honey crate between them. "What are you doing here?" David's voice was cold. It was the voice he used in the desert when a situation was turning hostile. James stepped forward, spreading his arms wide to take in the sprawling farm, the new warehouse, and the fleet of delivery vans. "We saw the feature on the national news, son. The veteran beekeeper. It was moving, David. Truly moving. We realized we had made a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" David laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "You kicked me out in the rain on Christmas because I was a Gant burden. You spent every cent I earned in the war on country club fees. We were under a lot of stress." Linda interjected, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "The economy, the house, we weren't ourselves. But family is family, David. We've come to make things right. We want to help you run this place. Your father has some excellent ideas for franchising Coleman Honey. We could take this global. David looked at James. He saw the greed behind the smile. They didn't see a son who had healed. They saw a brand. They saw a cash cow that they could milk once again. And Mark? David asked, looking at his brother. What about you? You were there that night. You didn't say a word when they threw me out. Mark looked down at his designer shoes, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Dave. I was scared they'd cut me off too. But they're right. We're a family. We should be together. David felt a surge of the old anger, the hot, destructive fire he had worked so hard to quench. He looked at his grandfather, Henry, who was standing in the shadows of the barn, watching silently. Henry nodded almost imperceptibly as if to say, the choice is yours. David took a long, slow breath. He thought of the bees. He thought of the way they dealt with intruders who came only to steal the honey without contributing to the hive. You're right, David said, his voice deceptively calm. Family is family. James beamed. I knew you'd see reason. Now, let's go inside and look at the books. I've already contacted a lawyer about restructuring the ownership into a family trust. I wasn't finished, David interrupted. He walked over to a table and picked up a single jar of honey. He held it up to the sun. This honey exists because I bled for it. It exists because Grandpa gave me a home when you gave me the street. It exists because I chose to survive your betrayal. He stepped closer to his father, his prosthetic clicking firmly on the gravel. He was taller than James now, powered by a strength that didn't come from a gym. You aren't my family, David said, each word a cold strike. You're just people I used to know. Mark, I hope you find the courage to be your own man someday. But as for you too. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a check. He had written it weeks ago, anticipating this very day. It was for the exact amount of his original savings, the money they had stolen. Here is the money you took from me. Take it. Consider it a management fee for the lesson you taught me about who not to be. But if you ever set foot on this property again, I won't call the police. I'll just open the gates to the North Meadow hives. And trust me, James, those bees haven't been fed yet today. James's face turned a mottled purple. You ungrateful brat. After everything we gave you, you gave me nothing but a reason to leave, David snapped. Now get out, before I lose my... As the black sedan sped away, kicking up a cloud of Oregon dust, Mark looked back through the rear window. David stood there, silhouetted against the mountains, a king of his own making. The sun began to set over the valley, casting a long, golden glow over the Coleman farm. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the low, contented hum of a million wings returning home for the night. Henry walked up beside David, resting a heavy hand on his grandson's shoulder. You handled that well. A master. I thought I'd feel angry, David admitted, watching the dust settle. But I just feel like I finally dropped a pack I've been carrying for 10 years. That's the secret, Henry said. The honey is only sweet if the hive is clean. The following months were the best of David's life. With the ghosts finally banished, the farm transformed into something even greater. David established the Coleman Veteran Foundation, a nonprofit that used beekeeping as a form of vocational therapy for soldiers returning from overseas. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a mentor. He sat on the same porch where he had once contemplated ending it all, and he talked to young men and women who had lost limbs, lost hope, and lost their way. He showed them his prosthetic, then he showed them the hives. You aren't broken, he would tell them. You're just in a different season. And even the hardest winter eventually gives way to the flow. Years passed. The farm became a landmark. David eventually met a local veterinarian named Sarah, a woman who understood the silence of the woods and the complexity of a scarred heart. They married under the great oak at the edge of the property, surrounded not by socialites and country club members, but by veterans, neighbors, and a grandfather who lived just long enough to see his great-grandchild crawl across the farmhouse floor. One evening, shortly after Henry had passed away peacefully in his sleep, David sat on the porch with his young son. The boy was fascinated by a single honeybee landing on a clover near his feet. Be careful, Daddy, the boy whispered. It might hurt. David smiled. picking up his son and tucking him into his lap. He looked out over the vast, golden empire he had built from the ashes of his old life. He felt the phantom pain in his leg, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a badge of honor. "No, son," David said softly, his voice echoing the peace of the valley. "She's not here to hurt. She's just doing her job. She's bringing the sweetness home. And as long as you treat her with respect, you never have to be afraid of the sting." David Coleman, the soldier who had been discarded by his own blood, had finally found the one thing money could never buy and the desert could never take away. He was home. And for the first time in his life, the silence wasn't lonely. It was perfect.